we mentioned this earlier, but we did have a big interview. We're very excited about it. They actually reached out to us.
Yeah, I was shocked.
We were like,
I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, James came in like, Jon Stewart wants to come on. We thought he was literally joking.
I thought he was joking.
Yeah. So, and not only did he come on, we got to sit with him for 30 minutes. Let's go ahead and put up, we have his show. We've got a little screen we can put up. It's called The Problem with Jon Stewart. I've been watching it pretty regularly. There it is, Problem with Jon Stewart. He's got a new season that has just started, and I think it's really excellent. The format is different from The Daily Show. He kind of does like a Daily Show type monologue at the beginning.
Right.
In my opinion, his political commentary is a little bit sharper than it used to be, which I appreciate.
More nuanced, too. He's had more time.
Yeah, well, that's true, too. I mean, it's not daily, so you have time to really sit with each topic, and then he pulls in, then it gets very serious. He pulls in experts and has a panel discussion, and he goes and does these very hard-hitting interviews with high-level people, you know, whether it's Janet Yellen or Jamie Dimon. I think he especially shines when it comes to the economic topic. So anyway, we had a chance to sit with Jon Stewart. We're going to play that interview for you now, and then on the other side, we're going to talk about some pieces that we wanted to get into but didn't have a chance. Let's take a look. All right, guys, I can hardly believe I am saying these words, but joining us now, the former host of The Daily Show and the current host of The Problem with Jon Stewart, the one and only Jon Stewart. Welcome. Great to have you.
Good to see you, sir. Oh.
Hold on. I'm about to make my entrance.
There he is.
Wow. A little bit older than I remember, but
very
looks
dramatic.
Good. Yeah.
Pretty good, right? Yeah, I thought
pretty good.
I thought that was pretty good.
So I really have genuinely been enjoying the show. We've actually talked about it here on Breaking Points a couple of times, but let's just start with.
Thank you.
Oh, of course, yeah. What was the sort of creative spark that led you to create this show and decide to come back into the media space at this time?
I think it was that sense of having worked down in Washington. The Daily Show was kind of an exercise in catharsis. An exercise in, sitting in your underwear yelling at the TV screen. And there was a certain impotent rage to it. But it also, for my creative mind, ran its course. I wasn't quite sure how to evolve it anymore. I wasn't quite sure what else to do with it. And I didn't want it to become a caricature or become rote. And you don't want to stay somewhere just because they're letting you. And you can see now, like, the other folks that had been on it have worked and evolved it into these different forms that have been really cool to see. You know, Oliver and Trevor and Sam, and like they've moved it and made it their voice. And that's the creative process. But I couldn't, for me, I just needed to step away and kind of engage more in the real world. And so after having done that, and seeing how the halls of power have a relationship with their constituents, but it's not one that is necessarily grounded in their needs or the necessities or their reality. Yeah. And so it stemmed from the idea of, like, why is that gap so difficult to bridge? And it seems fucking simple. Like, to be honest with you, a lot of this stuff seems simple. So it was like, you know, the impetus of the show is just, why not?
Right.
You know, you'd have these constituencies with these very real and urgent issues. You'd have the stakeholders in those issues very articulately stating what their problem is, or what their what the process is, or the perversion of that process. And then you have people who have an ability to affect change over that, disconnected from it. So the idea for the show is sort of simple, which is set the map on where the kind of corruption or perversion is in whatever issue we're talking about. Let some of the stakeholders express how that corruption or perversion affects what they're trying to accomplish or affects their lives, and then try and talk to somebody who might have a sense of how you could overcome that, or is in a position where they could affect it.
It's really interesting to see you in the
That's
new
sort
format.
Of long-winded.
No, it's fine. We're on the podcast. You don't have to worry about the commercial breaks or whatever. We got limitless time.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought.
What I enjoy is that while you were a source for me whenever you were on The Daily Show, you would always famously say, like, I'm a comedian, I'm not delivering the news. But here, you've really embraced both the comedy aspect, the explainer aspect, and then the news-making interviews. So how has that kind of changed your, not even calculus, but like the way that you guys come up with the constructs of the show? Because to sit down with a Bob Iger or to sit down with a Jamie Dimon, to sit down with the people that you are and to push them in a way that, or the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, both those are not necessarily things that might have happened in the previous era. And you've affected change. I mean, I think single-handedly are responsible for the word burn pits being uttered by the President of the United States in the State of the Union. How is that? How have you reflected on that in the context of the current show?
Well, I don't know. So part of it is Daily Show made its money on volume. We were there. So, we had to do four shows a week. So you're always there. So you would have those types of interviews, but you would also have, the third lead on New Girl and also somebody who wrote a book about how they built the Pentagon. So it was this wide variety of things. Or you'd have someone was asking me, well, there's an earnestness to the show, and how is that? And I feel like The Daily Show was very earnest. You may have thought it was cynical, but it wasn't. It was more pathetically earnest and idealistic. The only difference is we would have a correspondent deliver that earnestness with archness. They would approach it from the arch position, and then I would say, that sounds crazy. I would be the mirror to say to the person who is delivering an arch premise, but that sounds like it's backwards. Wah, wah. So, we had a lot of people on the show back when I was doing it that were newsmakers, from Rumsfeld to Sebelius to Pelosi to all these people that were Judith Miller. But I think it got in volume, it's forgiving in one sense, in that when you fuck up a show or you're not doing it well, or you can come back and take another crack at it the next day. But also everything blended together in kind of a stream of it. There becomes a certain meaninglessness to volume.
Yeah.
Because all it is it just plays into the churn.
Yeah, we totally get it. I mean, we experienced that. I don't know if you know our trajectory at all, but this show used to be at the Hill, and it was 5 days a week. And we've taken it independent and intentionally scaled it back to 3 days a week. Because, you just get in the cycle where you're like, you realize you're talking about stories that you don't actually really care about.
Exactly.
That you don't actually really think are a great use of the audience's time. You're hosting guests that you're like, this person's not really adding anything to the conversation. So for us, 3 days a week has been a good sweet spot in terms of being able to, we do a daily monologue, each of us think about, have a topic that we have time to get invested in. So I definitely hear that. I wanted to ask you, you've got a great new episode out on the media. We do a lot of media critique here as well, so I want to dig into that a little bit more. But one of my favorite episodes that you did was on the economy. And you took apart the sort of like moral panic over socialism, and also really pointed out that, guess what, guys, we have a lot of socialism for the rich. It's only when it's, to benefit the working class that suddenly we have these moral panics. And it just struck me watching that episode that the critique and the commentary was, to my ears, a little bit sharper, a little bit more pointed than from the Daily Show era. And first of all, I wonder if you agree with that, and if you feel like your politics have evolved or changed over the interim since you were, last doing the Daily Show.
I think my politics are relatively consistent. It's that, honestly, you could have lifted that, and I probably did, the socialism for corporations bit directly from the Daily Show. Again, I think it's got to do with having a little bit more time to craft something that can be a little bit more specific and a little bit more surgical. I think when you're, comedy in general, and especially as I wielded it, is pretty reductive just in general. Comedy is a distillation of a variety of biases and prejudices into, a kind of a catch-all bucket. And so I think for this, it was about trying to deconstruct the narrative of what is considered socialism. It's the idea that for a certain status quo population in America, an entitlement is just basically shit you don't need. And a stimulus is shit you need that you think is important.
Right.
And so it's trying to make that point that if you look at the status quo mainstream distillation of our economic policy, we have this identity. The show always tries to exist in the difference between what the image of something is versus the room where that image is planned, the meeting where they design that image. Sometimes it's purposeful, sometimes it's by happenstance, sometimes it's malevolent, sometimes it's just blind spots and ignorance. But it's looking at that, and it's pretty clear that the image of the United States as a beacon of free market capitalism, where the government doesn't choose winners and losers, and just this laissez-faire invisible hand creates the wealth. This is how God intended money to be made, is a fabrication and a fallacy. And I think the whole point of the episode was to show that as specifically as we could, and to show that it's all a manipulation. It's just a question of where the powers that be decide to put the emphasis in that moment.
Yep. I think that's a really important point. I remember thinking so much during the Trump era, whenever we had to react to some of the insanity, I was like, man, I wish Jon Stewart was around during Russiagate and some more. So to get to watch this episode was like a cathartic experience, because I remember thinking how important it would have been to have you around at that time. And I think the biggest problem, John, which you allude to, is, look,
I would have come to your house, by the way. You just should have called me. I'd have come to your house. You could have had me around.
I wish.
I could have sat on the couch with you and watched TV.
My mom would have been thrilled, man. But when I think about it, it's like, yeah, okay, Fox is bad. Right-wing media is bad. We agree, But so many of the same characteristics, the intertwinement of the administration, talking points, building up narratives, and as you point to in your interview with Bob Iger, is it's not just that the media is covering fear, it's that by their ridiculous and selective coverage, they're influencing the trajectory of policy and of politics in this country is just as easily applied to so much of whatever the corporate liberal media industrial complex as much as it is on the right. John, why is it so difficult to get the people in that complex to understand it? Having come from a more conservative background, I can tell you a lot of people at Fox, they know what's up. They know what they're doing. But the people at the Washington Post and the New York Times, they truly believe they're doing the Lord's work, exposing all of this, and they don't even see their own role in so much of the system that they're helping to perpetuate. That's why I always found your coverage so valuable. It's just skewering of everybody, which I think is where the majority of the country is. They hate it all of it.
Well, so one of the difficulties of the nihilism that you described is I think you have to understand it's about incentives and mechanisms, right? And the mechanism and incentivizing for right-wing conservative media is different from the mechanism and incentivizing for what you would consider mainstream or than left-wing media. So
yes,
it's not about a pox on all your houses. It's about criticism of or examining each thing as its own separate entity, but being as clear-headed and smart about what you believe to be. It's about looking at things on a different polarity, whereas the mainstream media has set up kind of this dynamic of right versus left because it's producible and it's a good source of conflict and it's reductive enough that you can repeat it. I mean, the one thing you guys know about making content is It's one thing to be able to make it. It's another thing to be able to make it all the time, every day, consistently.
Mm-hmm.
And that's their job. They're on the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or you have talk radio, or you have all these other things that have to be producible. And so producibility is an enormous foundational principle of the dynamic of right and left. What we're trying to do is look at it from a principle of corruption versus integrity, or noise versus clarity. Don't always obviously achieve that, but that's the goal. So, when you say something like the right-wing media, yeah, that's bad, but the left-wing media is bad too. It's not a question of them both being bad. It's a question of what is one trying to achieve, what's the incentive behind what they're trying to achieve, and how are they going about achieving it.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a big difference between what CNN does and what MSNBC does. And I think there's a big difference between what all of them do and what the right-wing media sphere is much more directed and much more politically aligned and entwined. I mean, you saw that after January 6th. The text messages back and forth were between the president of the United States and his handlers and Hannity and Ingram. And, the right wing's media is a much stronger arm of a political movement.
That is
CNN
true.
and MSN.
Although I do want to say, I mean, CNN just got caught in a big scandal where the president of the network and his mistress are stand accused of, helping Governor Cuomo at the height of his popularity, coordinating talking points, having him be interviewed directly by his brother in prime time. Jen Psaki is now being floated as a new host at either CNN or MSNBC. And Simone Sanders, who was comms director for the vice president, is at MSNBC. So I'm not sure that there's that much political detachment.
Yeah.
But there's revolving doors. And it's what I'm saying is the coordination. You can't have it on the left because the left is a much more fractious coalition. What I'm saying is their bias tends more towards sensationalism, right? And easy narrative. And it's not relentlessly focused on achieving political aims. They're just not. And if they are, they're really bad at it. And I would say the example you have about Chris Cuomo and Andrew Cuomo is much more about protecting one of their own than it is about protecting a political movement. That it had a lot more to do with nepotism and the cozy relationship between those industries than it did about, trying to advance Medicare for all.
Right.
Or, the right-wing media is about, and you've seen them have to flip now when you look at their coverage of Russia and Ukraine, right? So Russia is much more politically aligned with our political right. They're an Orthodox Christian state, defenders of Western value. So there was great kind of common purpose with our right-wing media. And then this guy goes like full Hitler and everybody's got to backtrack. But the fact remains that there is a lot of common cause in their sort of politics. Does that make sense? So I'm not suggesting that left-wing media is the same as mainstream media is the same as right-wing media. But what I'm saying is you have to be able to critique them for what they are and not put them all in the same pot. And it's not both siderism to do.
And there was one piece of that you pointed to there with regards to the Cuomo scandal that I think is correct, which is it was much more about, Zucker was interested in getting the governor of New York, who was this big political star at the moment, sort of exclusive to his network. It was great for ratings to have this little casual back and forth with his brother where they're joking about swabbing each other's noses or talking about mom's spaghetti dinner or whatever. So there was a money and corruption and nepotism angle there ultimately. And that was one piece that I felt like was a little bit left out of the episode that you did on the media, because you talk a lot about the pressure for sensationalism, for ratings, anchors getting the minute by minutes and seeing, okay, these stories, climate change is unsexy, but, Russiagate is very sexy, so we're going to lead with it every single night, and the walls are closing in and all of that. But I do think part of the problem is that sort of coziness and that clubbishness, where they're all in the same circle as the very people whose feet they're supposed to be holding to the fire. So that's how you end up with a situation like Governor Cuomo. And this wasn't just CNN. Everybody was lionizing this guy at the same time that there were real questions about the handling of nursing homes, about the corporate liability shield that he was helping to usher through that was used as a model by Republicans. And all of that was ignored because they were all sort of in the same social circles. And it's uncomfortable to hold people that you know and consider as peers to account.
Oh, I mean, yeah, you're dead on there. And I've said that to everybody who works here, and I said it to everybody at The Daily Show, which is when we all leave this show, look around this room, because these will be your only remaining friends. You know, we can't have colleagues. And, you know, that cozy relationship and everybody depending on each other for their livelihoods in that revolving door is an enormous issue. And it's why the, you know, White House correspondence issue should be taken out in the back and or sent to a farm upstate. Like the idea that, because you can't do your job while protecting access and feelings.
Yes.
Ever. And I think it's an enormous problem. But I think beyond that problem, you have to look at the dynamics of how they're incentivized to make their money. Look, there are people there that get bonuses for ratings, right? On the news. And so that naturally incentivizes it. Salaries are based on if you can drive a better demographic. So those are all the kinds of things that, and they're competing for a narrower and narrower audience. And I think if you drill down with almost any of them, they don't think that. Look, I'll give you an example. The way that they're covering Ukraine is bold, it's brave, it's immediate. A lot of times it's thoughtful. A lot of times it's illuminating. And it's heartbreaking, not just for what they're going through, but for having to be on the front lines of something so dangerous. But what it reminds you is there's a different model to do all this. What it does is point out the superficiality and the general tediousness and triteness of the majority of their coverage.
Yes.
Because it's not along the lines of, now let's bring on Van Jones and Rick Santorum to tell us how to put Ukraine into perspective. They're not using the right-left polarity. They're using right-wrong. They're using corruption integrity. Now, it doesn't mean that some of it isn't manipulated and some of it isn't redundant and overdone. But what it shows is there's another way to do this that's compelling, that is insightful, and within their grasp, that they have the tools. And that's all we're asking for, is cover it in a manner that is illuminating and not obfuscating. Because generally when you buy into the two-team paradigm there, and they do it differently, right and left and mainstream, you're buying into a false dichotomy, and one that clouds the conversation and doesn't, you know. So when you look at that, it's hard to imagine, well, if you've got the capacity to do it this way, why aren't we doing everything this way?
I think a lot of it is just current system thinking. Soledad O'Brien actually pointed that in your episode. Whenever Krystal and I started our show, actually a lot of what you said resonated with me. Whenever you told the Comedy Central guys, you're like, let me do what I want, and if you're not, you can fire me. Everybody told us that covering the news in a class first in a nonpartisan way was not gonna work. They're like, nobody cares, it doesn't matter, good luck, all of this. You know, now it's what, #1 or whatever in the news category on Spotify, which is not connected to a corporate media organization. Now, everyone said we were idiots.
Look at you! Come on!
Everyone said we were idiots.
No big
for
deal
doing
or
this.
whatever.
Yeah, not a big deal. Whatever. Yeah.
Let's fucking go!
No big deal.
But this is the point, though, which is that nobody wants to take that leap of faith.
Whatever.
Nobody wants to try. And within that framework, it's not going to happen at the most systematic level. But it's actually something I wanted to ask you, which is that you are one of those people who's not going to cut anybody slack in an interview. Yet, you got Jamie Dimon to sit down with you. You got Bob Iger to sit down with you. You got the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to sit down with you. What is the model then for people like us who are kind of coming up in your footsteps? Because we find this problem, Jon. Politician wants to come on, but he wants to talk for 5 minutes and stick to whatever his bullshit bill is. It's like, no, that's not how it works here. And then they say, okay, I'll go to CNN. I'll go to MSNBC. I'll go talk to the New York Times. You actually successfully broke through that barrier. How do the people who are coming up do the same thing? Or is it even possible to have the same level of household ID or whatever that you have from coming up in legacy media in the 2000s, the 1990s?
Well, first of all, your goal can't be household ID.
Well, it's not, to be clear. It's to get the big interview too, right? Right.
Well, but again, even that, what your goal should be is to get really good at diagnosing what are the corrupting or corroding influences in whatever story. It's about becoming a weatherman for bullshit, for figuring out how is this system incentivized for negative outcomes, or how is this system incentivized to keep the status quo in power at the expense of, disenfranchised communities or communities with less power. It's about power dynamics more than anything else. And it's about learning how those work and being able to diagnose them and being able to articulate them in a really clear way. And if you do that, and if you become really expert at that, and then you develop a constituency. Mm-hmm. And that constituency has value to salespeople. And politicians are salespeople at heart. And if you have a constituency that they feel is an important one, or that they feel will have consequences for them in a negative way, even if it's shame or if it's uplift, if you develop that, then you can't be ignored, because that's the right-wing media model. Mm-hmm. You develop this constituency that can't be ignored. My point is, develop it in a way that's honest and that is looking at systems not in a political way or a partisan way, but not being ignorant that those are the dynamics which can affect change. But make your arguments urgently and smartly about the dynamics of situations and nuance, and call out corrupted arguments wherever you find them.
Yeah.
And that helps you build a constituency that's, what it is earning your editorial authority.
Yeah.
And if you earn that, then you can use that to get access to do those things. But if your access is based on obsequiousness, or if your access is based on the care you will take for that person's, fragile status quo world, like, that's useless. It does no good. And you don't need the access. You can do your job. The jobs you guys do, you can do without access.
Certainly.
We do it every day.
Yeah, unfortunately have to. Yeah.
Jon, let me ask you this.
That's what I'm talking about.
Do you think that the cable news model is salvageable? Because, I even think about the Ukraine war, which you said, like, you feel really good about the coverage and they're doing, right versus wrong versus right versus left. But, at the same time, the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet is happening in Yemen right now. They don't find that good for ratings. It's also inconvenient for their friends and politicians, because Saudi is one of our allies versus Russia is one of our adversaries. Or you could look at the Afghan war. There was a lot of focus when we were finally, after 20 years, withdrawing our troops. And now that, our freeze on that the Afghan government's reserves is helping to spark a mass humanitarian crisis and famine, suddenly there's no coverage to be found. So given the fact that there is such sort of like selective coverage, all based on what's good for ratings, what's good for their friends in whatever political circles that, they're frequenting, is it possible to change the cable news model to be more edifying without just creating an entirely alternative eco-media system?
You just did it. You just did it. You just explained how to do it.
But don't you have to change the
cover
incentives? How do you change the incentives? Because right now, it's not about the individual people.
So,
There's a certain type of person that thrives in cable news because they're willing to sort of accept the system as it is. But it's really not about the individual people. It's about this system that's ratings-driven, that's access journalism-driven, that's 24-hour news coverage-driven. So can you change that really fundamentally without sort of changing that structure altogether?
So I guess I don't buy the premise that if you were to cover Yemen responsibly and give it the attention that it deserves, or the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, that you would suffer, that your ratings would be the problem. Now, there may be fluctuations, but it's already an incredibly small, narrow group of people, and it's designed by Nielsen, which is from like the 40s and 50s. So it's a nonsense rating system to begin with. So to be judging important stories, the larger problem for news organizations is they are really good at singular focus. So when you have an event that matches the magnitude of their news gathering firepower, that confluence works really well. But the truth is, they should be able to cover all those things. You're dead on right about Afghanistan. The high dudgeon that everybody took about the mistakes that were made in those 2 weeks, you're like, where the fuck have you been? And maybe if we had covered it with the kind of aggressiveness that it had deserved from the beginning, we wouldn't have been there for as long as we were, that we would have a different foreign policy that didn't rely on destroying countries and then being their social safety net for the next 15 to 20 years as we try and rebuild them to the point where they're friendly enough to us that 19 people in a basement in Hamburg couldn't plan an attack. I mean, the whole thing is nonsensical from the get-go. But that being said, these companies make their money on carriage fees. Like, Fox News makes almost $2 billion a year, not just for ratings, but on they make carriage fees. CNN makes carriage fees. MSNBC doesn't make the kind of carriage fees that they do.
So why do you think then, if it's not a ratings issue, why don't they cover what's going on in Yemen, for example? Because I would submit, and tell me if you think that I'm off base here. It's chauvinism, but it's, what's going on in Ukraine is okay for them to talk a lot about, because not only is it good for ratings, but it's also Russia is one of our adversaries, so we're not going against one of our allies. But in Afghanistan, now it's the Taliban in charge, and so we can't be, seem to be nice to them. And with regards to Yemen, Saudi is one of our big allies. They have a lot of, money in this town and all over the country, and a lot of ties to political leaders here. So it seems to me that that's a part of how they choose what to cover and what to go all in on.
No question. No question. I mean, it's, the Saudis are considered an ally. I mean, it's very hard to think of that regime as anything other than murderous, especially after Khashoggi and those kinds of things. It's a repressive regime, certainly. But I think the other thing that we have to talk about is what the people of Ukraine look like. They look like us.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And Muslims are scary, and that world is primitive, and Africa is primitive, and those worlds, I mean, they've said it. Trevor did an unbelievable bit on this, which was, a lot of news reporters going, you don't expect to see this kind of destruction in this part of the world.
Civilized place.
They're blonde-haired and blue-eyed. How could this be? They watch Netflix.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So I think you're dealing with a lot of, biases and prejudice are rife in everything. The question is getting us to overcome the blind spots, getting us to not have that. And I've sort of described it all the time as an 8-year-olds playing soccer. There's a ball and everybody runs to it and no one else is on the field. Like, hold your positions in other places to give people a better perspective on everything that's going on in the world. And it's not like it can't be done.
Yeah.
It can be done. And I think it can be done to profitability. Now, will it be the $1 billion that CNN makes off their carriage fees and things? I don't know, but it'll be fucking profitable. Yeah. And if you get the right people involved to it, it'll be dynamic, and it's about telling stories and telling them well.
Yeah, well, we agree with you, and people are hungry for, real, sort of unvarnished, as you put it, uncorrupted, attempts to sort through what is a complicated and nuanced world. So thank you, Jon, for your time again. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say one more thing.
Yeah.
Please.
When you talk about that, the thing that people always wonder is that doesn't mean it's not visceral or emotional.
Yeah. Right.
That's right, yeah.
It doesn't, it's not some hokey, like, let's all come together. Yeah, it's just trying to, one of the things that inspired us from The Daily Show that we tried to bring into this show is your willingness to, to just look at the landscape and point out the absurdities wherever they were. And the other thing that we really have tried to embrace here is engagement. Yep. That's probably the most controversial part of our show, to be honest with you. So thank you for that model. Guys, watch. The show is The Problem with Jon Stewart. We've got a nice little graphic we can put up there on the screen. It really is worth your... I've gotten a lot out of the show. Yes. I think the new model has a lot to recommend it. So thank you for your time today. We were grateful.
Thanks, Jon. It was a great honor. And everybody go subscribe to Jon's podcast. There's more. Thanks, man.
Oh, thank you. Keep up the great work, guys.
Thank you, sir.
Doing our best. Thanks, Jon. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.